We have studied the pollinations. There are two types of the pollinations. One we call is a cross pollinations. Another one is a self pollinations. Now we are going to study the agents of the cross pollinations. Cross pollination is takeover. Some agents are necessary to carry the pollen grains from anther to stigma. So this is the one we are going to discuss. In order to bring about the cross pollinations, it is necessary that the pollen grain should be carried from one flower to another flower. So this is the one. So even though if there is a cross pollination takeover in the plants, so somebody is carried or some animals or birds have to carry the pollen grains from one flower to another or different flower. In order to bring about the cross pollinations, it is necessary that the pollen grain should be carried from one flower of another flower of a different plant. So agents can be animals, insects, wind and water. So these are the agents can help the cross pollinations. So first we are going to study the pollinations by wind. The pollinations with the help of the wind, it is called anemophily. Anemophily means we should know the pollinations happening with the help of the wind. So how the characters of the flower of the anemophilous flower? The anemophily flowers produce the enormous amount of the pollen grains. So basically it produces a large number of the pollen grains because we can not expect all the pollen grains or reach the stigma of the flower. A few pollen grains have to carry to the stigma. Some of the or most of the pollen grains going to waste. So in order to that, the plants is to produce the more amount of the pollen grains. The pollen grains are small, smooth, dry and light in weight. So these are the character of the pollen grains of anemophilous flower. So if the pollen grains have to carried by the wind, the pollen grain should be small in size, smooth, dry and light in weight. So these are the characters of the anemophilous flowers. So first, anemophily means the pollination is happening with the help of the wind. The anemophilous flower produce an enormous amount of the pollen grains, and the pollen grains are small, smooth, dry and light in weight. So these are the characters of the flower. The pollen grains of such a plants are float off at a distance more than 1,000 kilometers. So the pollen grains may be carried by the wind. It may go for a distance more than 1,000 kilometers. So the stigma, how to be receive the pollen grains? The stigma are comparatively large. The stigma comparatively large. So the stigma is a large. It is not inside the flower. It is go above the flower. In order to get it, it's very easy. Look at these plants. How it is seems to be is out of the plants. It is the top of the plants. So when the pollen grain is carried, what will happen? It is easily to attach or reach the stigma of the flower. So this is also one of the anemophilous flowers. Look at that. So the flower is above the plants. So these are some of the plants. So look at that. It is not inside the plants. It is outside the plants or is a large in size. And sometimes the hairy to drop the pollen grains. So sometimes in the stigma seems to be like a hairy. There are some hairs are present. which attach to the pollen grains or which grab the pollen grains or which help the pollen grain to attach the stigma. So some of the example they have given grass and some of the hattie. Now the pollen grains by the insects. The pollen grains with the help of the insects like the honey, bee, flies are called endomophily. So the pollination is happening with the help of the insects. Maybe it may be a butterfly or it may be a honeybee or flies, whatever may be. It is done by that with the help of the insects. That pollinations we call is a endomophily. So what are the characters of the flower? To attract the insects, these are the flower are brightly colored, have smell and nectar. When you look at the flower, it is the bright color. So it attracts the insects. It attracts the butterfly and have smell. So good smell will comes. So in order to that it attract the insects and nectar. So the honey. So maybe is presence in the flower. So the insects comes there to suck the honey or nectar from the flower. Meanwhile, the pollen grains are attached. So look at this. So the pollen grains attach the legs of the honeybee. So like that the insects also is carried the pollen grains, and when you go to the another flower, the pollen grain may be deposited on the stigma of the flower. So this is the way the pollination is done by the insects. So that's the way we call is a endomophily. So the endomophily flower is a brightly colored, smell and nectar to attract the insects. Then this is also is some of the characters of the pollinations by the insects. The pollen grains are a large in size. The pollen grain is a large in size because many pollen grains maybe is attached in that leg of the insects. So when you fly one place to another place, it may be happen is fall off. So a large number of the pollen grains are attached. At the same time is a large in size also. Exine. Exine means the outer layer of the pollen grains. So the outer layer of the pollen grains is a pity. Pity means like this. The small hole like a structure is present, and if spinny means it's a throat like a structure is present. So they can be adheres firmly on the sticky stigma. Sticky stigma, it means it can able to stick in the stigma of the flower. So when you deposit by the pollen grains by the insects, the pollen grains can stick with the stigma. Approximately 18% of the pollen grain is done by the insects is carried by the honeybee. So honeybee have a vital role which help the pollinations in the plants. So 80% of the pollen grains is done by the honeybee when you compare with the other insects. Pollination by the wind. So the pollinators with the help of the water is carried the hydrophily. So it means the pollination is carried or the pollinations done by the water, that we call is a hydrophily. So these take place in aquatic plants. We know that aquatic plants, it is nothing, the plants which is lived in the water, or so the water is the agents for to carry the pollen grains. So that such a plants we call is a hydrophilous plant, or the pollinations is carried, or the pollinations say that is a hydrophily. So what are the characters of the pollen grains? The pollen grains are produced in a large number. So many pollen grains are produced. Certainly we cannot say that all the pollen grains to reach the stigma of that. So a few maybe is reached the stigma of the flower. That's the way the plants is produce the more amount of the pollen grains. The pollen grains float on the surface of the water till they are learned on the stigma of the female flower. So the pollen grains can float or travel the surface of the water when it reach the stigma of the female flower. So the female flower also is above the water, such a way that is the pollen grains reach the stigma of the flower. For examples, they will call hydrilla and vallisneria. So these are some of the plants can be done by the water. So look at the female flower and water. So what will happen though such a way, so it is attached, the pollen grain is float on the surface of the water, so it will reach the stigma of the flower. So pollinations by animals. So what do you mean by the pollinations by? When the pollination is to take place with the help of the animals, it is called a zoobilee. So some of the animals is help the pollinations. How that the pollinations maybe is carried by the wind or insects or like that. Some of the pollinations maybe is help the with the help of the. So how it is? The flower, such a flower attract the animals by the brightly colored size, scent, or is a good smell. So some of the flower have brightly colored, big in size, and nectar. So it attract the birds or it attract the some of the animals. So sunbirds pollinated the flower of the canna, cladily. So quails pollinated by a silk cotton trees. So this we call is the cladily plants. This is we call is a canna plant. So there's two plants is maybe is done by the animals. So look at that, the flower is brightly colored, so it will attract the animals or it attract some of the birds. So this or we call is a anemophily. So sorry, this called as zoobilee. So when you take that is agents of the cross pollinations, there are four agents are there. One is animals, insects, wind, and water. So if the pollinations is happening by the winds, that we call is a anemophily. Look at the flower, maybe is a enormous flower. Amount of the pollen grains maybe is a small and smooth, dry, light in weight. Also the characters of the pollen grains. The pollen grains maybe is traveled more than 1,000 kilometers by the wind. The stigma also is large in size, so it will maybe above the plants. So it easily attract the or it catch the pollen grains. Pollinations by the insects, that we call is the endomophily. So the flower characters maybe is a brightly color, have the scent and nectar. So the insects, the endomophily, the pollen grains are is large in size. The exons have some of the characters which is help for that. So nearly 80% of the pollen grains, the pollination is done by the insects, that is a honeybee. So the pollen grains maybe is carried by the water, that we call is a hydrophiles. So this maybe is happening in the aquatic plants. The pollen grains should be produce a larger number. So the pollen grains may float on the surface of the water, maybe is catched by the stigma of the flower. And animals, that we call is a zoobilee. when the pollen grain is done or carried from one flower to another flower by the animals, that we call is a jubilee. So the flower also in the same, the brightly colored, so it may produce the nectar and is big in size. So that's such a way the plants maybe is attracted, or the flower maybe is attracted by the animals. So it may be reached that animals is carried the pollen grain one flower to another flower. Thank you.